Hello, everyone, and welcome to our discussion today on the topic of social innovation. We're joined by a fantastic panel of guests, yeah, I just wanted to firstly thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mark.
Yeah, great to have you. And so before I go ahead to introduce the speakers, I thought I'd just start off by just sharing briefly kind of the structure for those who might be new to how we organize these discussions, as well as a very short introduction as well to the topic. And so how we typically do these discussions is that obviously there's a short introduction, I'll introduce the guests, and then we'd have kind of like a fireside chat, kind of like a panel discussion format around the topic of social innovation. And this whole bit will last for about an hour. And then at the end, we'll add an extra 15 minutes for audience questions. So, for all of you joining us at home on YouTube, then please do share any questions that you might have in the YouTube comment stream. I will try to get to them at the end. And so just to kind of introduce the topic, I thought that given that a few of you might be quite new to the idea of social innovation, some of you might have heard of it before, I thought a good place might be to try and define the term. And I say try because there's of course different definitions depending on which angle you look at from. But I think that this one from the Stanford Center for Social Innovation encapsulates it quite well. So their definition is that social innovation is the process of developing and deploying effective solutions to challenging and often systemic social and environmental issues in support of social progress. And one thing I quite like about this definition, as you might have picked up, that there was the word systemic in there, so systemic social and environmental issues. And I think this is what, in a way, ties it so well, I think, with the work that we're doing at Systems Innovation, in that, of course, the goal, in a way, is this idea of social progress and then environmental, social environmental progress. But also it really ties in this idea behind kind of systems change, I think, very effectively as well. And systems innovation isn't necessarily just about doing more of the same better. So it could be, for example, having impacted more people. Of course, that's great. But in some ways, it could be almost about changing the structure of the system as well, changing the relationships, for example, how power might be distributed so that it's more socially equitable. And I think one good example of that could be Wikipedia, which in a way innovated by creating a new way for people to kind of coalesce and organize information in quite a self-organizing, community-oriented way. And I think another thing, lastly, that makes social innovation quite useful as a concept is that it's industry agnostic. So I did both my dissertations on the topic of social entrepreneurship. And what I found with that was that it's very useful, but it was quite specific in what type of organizational structure it had to be to fit in that category. Whereas with social innovation, it can apply whether you're a government, a for-profit, or a charity. It's really quite universally applicable. And so this seems to be a topic that's very kind of relevant to us today. And especially given the many challenges that, of course, that we're facing, and also the size and the complexity of these challenges, that increasingly it's become quite evident that one stakeholder group, such as the government, isn't able to kind of tackle in a holistic way. It really requires different stakeholder groups to come together. And so for that reason, I think I'm really excited, and I feel very fortunate to have with us today this very experienced panel who've all been immersed in this field of social innovation from kind of slightly different angles. And so to introduce the speakers today, we first have Sharon Zivkovich, who is the co-founder and chief innovation officer at Wicked Lab. Her organization aims to build the capacity of organizations, governments, and communities to better tackle the wicked problems by creating systemic change. She's also the founder and CEO of Community Capacity Builders and was previously a lecturer on social entrepreneurship at the University of Adelaide. Next, we have Liz Skelton, who is known for her work and expertise as a leader consultant, author, and facilitator of leadership for social and adaptive systems change. She is the co-founder and director for Collaboration for Impact, whose mission is to help communities tackle the root causes of their toughest problems and achieve large-scale social change. She is also the founder and director of the Adaptive Practice and is the co-author of the book, The Australian Leadership Paradox. And finally, we have Per Olsen, who is a PhD researcher at the Stockholm Resilience Centre and leads the centre's work on transformation for sustainability, working with agency and system entrepreneurship. In 2019, he was recognized by the Web of Science as one of the world's most influential researchers of the past decade, and has recently developed the concept of T-Labs, or transformation labs, which is a new methodology for generating innovative approaches for rewiring social ecological systems. And so to kind of start off our discussion today, I thought it would be a useful starting point just to ask the panelists, and maybe Liz, we could start with you for this and move on to Sharon and Per. Just in a few sentences, how each of you would describe your own relationship with this topic. So yeah, over to you, Liz.
Thanks, Bowen. Okay, so that's a big place to start. I guess in Collaboration for Impact, we would talk about social innovation being really a key practice and way of working in how to change the conditions that are holding complex problems in place. So we see innovation really, I guess your definition was interesting about a kind of a solution and a way of working. And I think we would probably see it as an integral part, along with many others, as looking at how we determine where is disruption required in a system and how do we work differently, test and try and iterate. I think a key component for us is that we see that the people most impacted by the complex problem as being integral to being part of that innovation. And so what that looks like is engaging and mobilizing citizens. And if you like, trying to build a movement of people who can work in this way around systems change, social innovation, and thinking about what's the kind of leadership we need, what's the kind of engagement and collaboration that we need to make sure that we can test and try and iterate into coming up with new solutions. So I think very separately from traditional approaches, that it is very much about changing a mindset and a way of working from a linear predictive way of working to one that is analyzing, diagnosing, but testing and trying on the ground and taking the people most impacted with you as co-creators of that change. It's probably more to it than that, but that would be, I guess, the kickoff.
Brilliant, thank you. And yeah, on to you, Sharon.
Yeah, I'd say the work that I'm involved with is very much a systemic social innovation approach. So back in 2012, the EU funded a Social Innovation Europe project, and the final report actually focused on systemic social innovation. And the report came to the conclusion that that was the type of innovation that was needed to address complex wicked problems, so complex social policy problems. And it actually said in the report, it actually says in the report that an understanding of complexity science, if practitioners have an understanding of complexity science, they're better able to take this type of approach. And the systemic social innovation approach is very much about focusing on innovations, but also focusing on the innovation of how innovations come together, so that if you're addressing in a place a particular complex social policy problem, you're focusing on the innovation in the initiatives, but also in the innovation in the interrelationships between those initiatives. So both the work of Wicked Lab and the work of community capacity builders actually looks at different aspects of that systemic social innovation.
Brilliant, thanks for that.
Yeah, thanks. So my engagement in social innovation is I came into it as a research field. So it's a research field that builds on sociology, organizational change, and also complexity and systems change. So, and my mentor in this has been, I'm probably going to mention her a lot during this hour, is Frances Wesley at University of Waterloo, who has been sort of instrumental in introducing me to this field. So, and we have used the social innovation so research to explore transformation as a specific type of change, and especially focusing on the transformative capacity needed to navigate transformations towards just and sustainable futures. So we focus a lot on bringing in the ecological aspects into the field of social innovation, and we are interested in understanding innovation and aspects of scaling, and also the role of agency, which I can talk about more later, and how it relates to some of these issues that we raise here. So, and the way you define it resonates a lot with me, because I come from resilience science, and we focus a lot on social ecological systems, but also transformation. And we also introduced the specific role of crisis, which is very sort of relevant for the times we live in right now, but sort of add that. So combining that with the social innovation research field has been really, really good for understanding transformations. So I can say something about, because I work in practice also with some change makers programs, so I can just mention that now. So another part of how I engage in social innovation is through practice, and running and being the director of a couple of programs for change makers that focus specifically on increasing the capacity to be a change agent, and also to achieve transformative systemic change. I'll get back to that also.
Brilliant. Yeah, thank you very much. And so I think now might be a good time, and maybe Sharon, you'd be a good person to answer this question, which is, for those who might be new to this field of social innovation and social entrepreneurship as well, how would you describe the meaning of the term? And I know that we've briefly kind of talked about a definition, so anything you might want to kind of add or elaborate or even disagree with that. And also, outside of explaining the meaning of it, in what ways might you say it's different from, say, conventional entrepreneurship or conventional innovation?
Thank you for that one. I think I'd like to point out that not all social innovation and social entrepreneurship is systemic. And so if you look at social innovation, like traditional innovation, you can have like innovation in products and services, and you can have innovation in processes, and you can have incremental innovation, social innovation. So social innovation, if you use Jeff Morgan's definition, it's coming up with like a new idea that works in addressing a social goal. So in saying that, there's these different aspects of social innovation, and I think they've all got a use depending on what kind of problem you're trying to address. If you're getting into the complex, wicked problem, then you're really looking at the systemic area. And it's also the same with social entrepreneurship. I don't think it should be called social entrepreneurship. I think it should be called social entrepreneurships, because there's so many different kinds. If you're in Scotland compared to England, compared to mainland Europe, compared to America, there's these different types of social entrepreneurship. A lot of the types have actually had a social enterprise focus in recent years. But if we go back to 1980, when the term was first coined by Bill Drayton, it had a systems change focus. So the focus was on an understanding of the system and working out where to intervene in the system. And I can see that movement coming back now with like the University of Oxford's Map the System competition. then in 2008 and 2010, we had a couple of international conferences on social entrepreneurship, systems thinking and complexity. And that really saw the start of a complexity approach to social entrepreneurship, which was more about the transitions of ecosystems of initiatives. So I would say that both the concept and the social innovation and the concept of social entrepreneurship are both very broad. How they differ with regards to traditional innovation and traditional entrepreneurship. The traditional innovation, the social purpose isn't central to traditional innovation, but it is for social innovation. For social entrepreneurship, all of the different forms are really interested in bringing resources together, both human resources and capital resources, to go after a social opportunity in a changing context. And because of that, the types of resources that are brought together for social entrepreneurship are often very different than traditional forms of entrepreneurship. So you would have, in social entrepreneurship, you bring in volunteers. That's not a traditional resource that you bring into mainstream entrepreneurship. Social entrepreneurship is usually a lot harder to access capital than other forms of entrepreneurship. With social enterprise forms of social entrepreneurship, the definition that uses a lot is that they trade, that 50% of their revenue is from trade. And so they can still access grants and donations where that isn't the normal way of doing traditional entrepreneurship. So that's a few differences.
Yeah, brilliant, thank you. And yeah, curious, Liz or Per, if there was anything in particular you might have wanted to add to that in terms of fleshing out what it means kind of on a high level?
Maybe the perspective that I would bring is from being a practitioner on the ground and working alongside collaborative initiatives who are trying to tackle complex problems. And I guess it's interesting, all the different language that we're using around it, because I guess what we see is on the ground, the method and the process that people are using, it's not language that people use. It's language that we use. It's language we use as, you know, academics, consultants, practitioners in it. And so I think there is work that we're doing all the time about how do we translate the processes and methods that we bring in a way that has meaning for the people on the ground who are grappling with it and working with it. So how that tends to play out, and I guess how we see it, is a shift in focus from looking at, say, one part of a system. So for example, a lot of the work we're doing in Australia is working alongside and walking alongside place-based or geographical initiatives who are looking at how do we address complex problems like unemployment, Indigenous disadvantage, which, you know, is very entrenched in a lot of the ways that systems work and how they perpetuate that, and is interconnected with many issues, unemployment, early childhood issues. So what social innovation looks like in that context is that, you know, we're constantly exploring as we go with them around and really bringing, say, an adaptive leadership lens to that, which is my background and context, where you're exploring all the time, where are the edges in the system that we need to conserve? Because I think this is the interesting thing with social innovation, that so much of the work of adapting to a new reality is figuring out what needs to be conserved and what do we maintain and develop, as well as where do we innovate? And that in that first horizon, if you like, is business as usual. The innovation is often in the mindsets, the ways of working. And what that's looking like, and again, you know, the pace of change is slow on these issues, is that it's bringing people together in a different way to actually conceive of the problem differently, and who should be involved in that, and who gets to define what the problem is. So again, coming back to in the Australian context, a lot of our work with First Nations communities, typically social issues have been defined for the communities or defined by government or others, and the boundaries of the issue and the system have been set by other people. So I guess this is an example where we would be working on how do we actually define and bound the system in a way that serves the people on the ground who are most affected by it. Now, that in itself is a mindset shift, the way then of working. And I think as Sharon referred to about the interconnections between the different parts of system, about bringing different suspects to the table, bringing different people in to come to look at the issue, to look at things like how do we shift power so that in the context in Australia, and I guess other countries where there's more marginalized populations, that the more disadvantaged communities actually were shifting the power dynamic there. So it's more self-determined by them and they're taking more of a leadership role. So I think this is where, you know, the emphasis that I would bring is there's many tools and processes we use, and they're helpful alongside. I'm really interested in how do we work on the behaviors and the practice and the way of working, which mean that whatever tool or process is applied, it's going to stick because people are approaching it with that mindset around innovation and systems change. I think social entrepreneurship, just I can only speak about that from being involved in setting one up and in previous contexts, but collaboration for impact, we've set ourselves up as a networked social enterprise and we're moving into that, and it's highly organic. And I think what we're trying to do is bring a networked approach, because increasingly we're working in a network world, that if we want to be bringing about systems change, we need to be able to activate different parts of the system at any one time, and no one organization has all those skills. So you know, again, we're having to, if you like, walk the talk of being, how do we test and try different models? Where do we need some traditional kind of management and structure to enable that emergent process to come out and to figure out where is the innovation? Because innovation by itself doesn't necessarily change the system. You know, it's what else do we keep in other parts? What do we shift? And I think power is really a key element and a key lever that we're seeing sitting underneath a lot of it.
Thank you.
I can also jump in there and just say something about how we think about it when we do, especially when we do research. So as I mentioned, social innovation has helped us explore agency as one of the parts, important part of transformation. And as you mentioned, that in the definition, you have transformative change involves a change in all these different dimensions like power, resource flows, roles and routines, deep values, etc. But what we're also adding to that a transformation also has to involve not just the fundamental change in these dimensions, but also fundamental change in how we relate to the planet, like our relationship with the ecosystems. And so, but also we talk about the change has to happen at different levels. So it's change in practices, change in rules and regulations, and also a change in these sort of underlying values. So that also forces us also to think more broadly about agency and the role of individuals and organizations. So what we talk about is that we talk about social entrepreneurs as the ones that introduce the new practice. We talk about institutional entrepreneurship, institutional entrepreneurs or policy entrepreneurs that focusing on changing the rules and regulations. And then we have moral entrepreneurs or norm entrepreneurs that focus on changing how we think about our values, our worldviews, and how we use to interpret the world around us. So, and we say that you need all of these in order to change systems. And that's also what Sharon and Liz talks about too, is that we need all those to change the system. So it's not just about social entrepreneurship, it's about connecting with other types of change agents at different levels. So there, I think it's social innovation it's been useful in exploring that, and also to push the whole thinking about social entrepreneurship for change, also as has been addressed here, which I really like, that sort of broaden it. So we talk about that there's no system entrepreneur. You're not a system entrepreneur. There's system entrepreneurship, and that it's a distributed agency that relies on many change makers. And I like that with you, Sharon, also the adding that S there. This is important sort of tweaks, I think.
I think what,
yeah, sorry, Liz.
yeah, I was just going to build on that by saying, I think what it's speaking to and what you've said, Per and Sharon, is that what we're seeing increasingly more is, if you like, a kind of movement building around whether it's whatever we call, whether it's system entrepreneurs, but people who have developed that capacity, which again isn't a capacity that is necessarily, there's not a place traditionally that we've been able to go to learn about that, but it's increasingly in demand that we look at how do we develop this muscle to deal with greater complexity and uncertainty. And it's certainly something we saw as a gap when we started to build Collaboration for Impact 6 years ago, but looking at what does that look like globally, particularly when we're in a dominant paradigm which rewards more traditional linear approaches. If you're thinking about Cynefin framework to deal with the more simple and complicated challenges, and what we find as a barrier is that the systems that we work in, we're saying they're constant recruiters of status quo, and so people are not rewarded necessarily or incentivized to work in ways that address the complex problems. In fact, many of the barriers, at policy level, government level, perpetuate that. So there is work. I think the role of social innovation is how do we disrupt that by thinking about it as a skill and a growing edge that particularly things like that we're in at the moment around COVID really give us the opportunity to highlight that there's we're in a changing world and we're going to be constantly navigating these. So I think that's what's exciting to me, hearing what you're saying, Per and Sharon, about the more that we can as a field frame the skill and the work that's needed, and that is endorsed and valued, then it gets incentivized.
Yeah, I find it very interesting, just kind of pulling some threads that came up in that thread was, one thing I really enjoyed, which was the theme that came up, was that it's not about, when we think about innovation, maybe in a more conventional sense, we kind of think, oh, we just want to have this one project, which, is going to, for example, make us lots of money or have a big impact. And that's okay. But actually, sometimes, and I really liked how you put it, Liz, it's not just finding this adding this extra thing. Sometimes it's about just finding a different way of bringing people together, a different way of crafting the relationships for how action is done, maybe in a more collective sense, and creating that kind of platform to do so. And I think this could be a good segue into this. I'd be curious to hear your answer to this, Per. Is that we talked about kind of the systemic aspect of social innovation. And given that one of the goals of social innovation is that of systemic change, which we've talked about, in order to achieve better social and ecological outcomes, in your view, in what ways has systems thinking and the complexity sciences, which you've talked about, supported these aims? And what kind of potential do you see in the intersection between these fields of social innovation and kind of complexity and systems theory?
Yeah, I think a couple of things that comes to mind when it comes to what it has contributed with is to understand systems as often closed, but sometimes open, and how crisis can open them up for change, and that seemingly rigid systems can go through quite a major change at a certain point. I think it's also has contributed to starting to map transformative change as multi-level and multi-phase processes. So I think it has helped us think about the patterns of transformation, and we, for example, we think about when it comes to these levels that I talked about before, the 3 levels. You can call them, maybe sometimes they're called micro, meso, and macro, based on Giddens kind of thinking, and has been sort of used in a lot of transformation theories, and also, but also that transformations have different phases. So because, and it's linked to this issue that systems are more or less closed. So we have, when we talk about transformations, we talk about moving from one state to another. We use the sort of the stability domain thinking, and the systems change involves maybe a movement across a threshold, tipping point. And so you can start to see that transformation moves in different phases, where you have maybe a long period of just preparing the system for change and trying to sort of move the system, but it's very difficult because you have the self-reinforcing feedbacks that keeps it in a certain place. And then but at some point you might have these windows of opportunity, maybe by a crisis or something, that suddenly you're able to move, and maybe going in what we call the navigation phase, navigating the transition and that threshold. And then, which is about maybe going from developing ideas to actually institutionalize the ideas, or a set of ideas. And then, at that point in time where you have institutionalized things, maybe you move into more the stabilizing phase, which is moving into the other stability domain. And that and that sort of completes sort of a transformation. But that also we also talk about then you need, it's obvious then, if you look at South Africa and take that as an example of moving from an apartheid system to a democracy, and you can start to sort of understand the capacities that are needed in these different phases. So there's certain capacities associated with preparing the system for change. And then there are different capacities that we are in actually right now with the COVID, and actually when you have the opportunity, how do you move from all these sort of good ideas that are out there to actually institutionalize and also achieve systems change, and sort of moving radical ideas to disruption. And there's a lot that can happen on that journey, right? Co-optation and just sort of closing down, or rejection, and fighting your ideas. And then you need other capacities down for stabilization and consolidation and so on. So I think that's how this complexity thinking and systems thinking have really helped us really start to be specific about what capacities do you need in the specific phase at the specific level, at the micro level, in the preparation phase, or at the macro level at the transition phase. So I think that's what I'm excited about right now at the moment. Yeah. So I'll stop there.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Per. And I'd love to open this up as well for Liz and Sharon, if you have any thoughts on that. Yeah. But one thing I feel that you just pointed on, Per, and I think is so relevant for us today is, you talk about crises, and you talk about change as maybe going through these phases and reaching past these tipping points. And, COVID, this whole situation we're in now is quite unprecedented, and it is a crisis point. And I'm very curious if anybody has any thoughts as well on how these ideas that we're talking about in social innovation specifically, maybe, but also feel free to add to the first question as well, just to kind of open this up there. Sharon, I see you.
Yeah, very, very interesting, Per, because Wicked Lab takes a very similar approach to what you just described then with regards to system transitions. So we've developed software to help with regards to identifying those characteristics and initiatives for transitions. And it aligns very nicely with a complexity approach to social entrepreneurship, which is about how do you move from one state to a more cohesive state that is more effective at addressing a complex social policy problem. And that has been really a major focus of my work for quite a while. And so this complexity approach to social entrepreneurship, as I said, came to the fore really around 2008 from some academics at Adelphi University in New York. They put out a couple of papers, a couple of journal articles, and they also ran a couple of international conferences. And so, as I said, Wicked Lab takes that approach. I think where where I've probably, and I'm still very passionate with regards to system transitions, but I think with the work that we've done in recent years of bringing ecosystems of initiatives together for transitions, I've kind of like gone back into a more systems approach rather than a complexity approach for social entrepreneurship. And the systems approach is the original 1980 Ashoka type of approach, where you're actually understanding your system and looking at where to intervene in a system to have the biggest impact. And the reason why I've kind of like gone back there, and Wicked Lab focuses on the transitioning, the complexity approach, community capacity builders focuses on the systems approach, working with individual social entrepreneurs with that agency of where they can intervene in a system. And the reason for that is that you still need strong initiatives within systems. So where the focus has been on transitioning ecosystems of initiatives from one state to another state, my other enterprise community capacity builders focuses on developing system-aware initiatives. So it's initiatives within ecosystems that see themselves as part of ecosystems, so that when we actually come to transition ecosystems of initiative, we've got those initiatives that see themselves as part of a system as well. And so that's been a real, this is something that's only come for me in the last couple of years, but it was really interesting to go down the complexity rabbit hole and then to come back up and say, hold on a sec, if we're transitioning crap, we've got to have strong initiatives that we're actually transitioning. So that's been a major kind of like light bulb moment for me.
It's interesting, I guess, listening to what you're both bringing in, and if I reflect on, I guess, my own process with this, that previously I was working in social leadership and looking at, what kind of leadership do we need to tackle complex problems, and drawing very heavily on adaptive leadership as a process and building that capacity in people. And I think what I started to see over time, that the challenge with that was we were working with systems theory and systems thinking and applying adaptive leadership. And the challenge was, though, to then build a movement of people to then go back into systems and try and intervene as one sole agent with a language and a methodology and a way of working that, of course, the system constantly pushes back on. So really the journey that I've been on since then, and with Collaboration for Impact, is looking at, rather than us going out with whether it's social innovation, complexity theory, systems innovation, whatever, that more about, if you like, building a toolkit of a whole range of different methodologies and approaches to be able to go in to look at what is the challenge that is being addressed here. So, it could be anything from, we've been working with people working on the drug reform system in Australia, bringing together people from across sectors to go, where are the intervention points? How do we nudge that system along? To working, on the ground with communities who are trying to lead change. That really the context is determining what is required and what approach is required, and then digging into and drawing on complexity science, systems thinking. And I think the need for that diversity and pluralism, if you like, of approaches and methods is really key, because I mean, speaking for myself, and as we've got tripped up when previously we were going out very much looking at the collective impact approach, which in Canada and the US has been getting a lot of traction. And the conditions are very different in Australia around that. So what we've tried to do is work with a whole range of stakeholders to really slow down and go, what are the conditions on the ground in place and what's being called for? What's the kind of challenge you're trying to address, to then determine what capacity is needed. And when you described the different frames, I thought, there's so many frameworks to draw on. And what I see is communities getting a wee bit bamboozled and saying, can you guys in the field sort out the difference between all of these and then bring them to us in a way that's accessible and that we can navigate and use them? And what we did was kind of took some of that and, you know, did a bastardized version, if you like, which we call the collaborative change cycle. And it does speak to many of the phases that you've said, Per. And, you know, we developed it, it's now on our platform, Platform C, and already it's out of, you know, it's out of date because what's happening on the ground has gone way faster than a lot of the theory and methodology that we've tried to capture. But that really talks to, I think, a really important phase around addressing complex challenges, which is how do we build readiness within a system to address it? So it's different when we've got something like COVID, which we have no control over. But many of the challenges we're dealing with are ones which are competing, you know, so from the climate emergency to entrenched disadvantage, which is affecting a sector of society, in inequality. Now, to get attention on that issue is really hard to try and wake up the kind of dominant mainstream systems, if you like. So a lot of the work has been, is there really readiness? How do we build that readiness to come at it differently so that we don't end up going in with a linear approach, a pre-planned idea of what's going to work there, and really testing and trying and calling for a new way of working, but giving people an experience of what that looks like. So we've coined this the readiness runway as a first phase. And again, it's not linear, of course, these things can be happening at the same time. But then doing, how do we build the foundations while we're working on what is a kind of shared agenda for change? And at the same time, we might be building readiness in other parts of the system, in the political part, while we're working with the community on what their shared agenda is, while there might be testing and trying in other aspects of the system. So I think thinking about it in those phases, from readiness to building foundations, building a shared vision, then starting to align the system around mutual activities and testing and trying to then look at how do we implement and scale. But again, you know, people can be in different parts of that. And I wonder if sitting underneath a lot of that, and Mark Cabage, one of our partners in Canada, he talks a lot about the idea of, you know, incremental nudges along the way, that we're kind of nudging the system to look at where are those leverage points for change. And as we're doing that, we're building power and agency. But we're also looking at the kind of capacity. This is at the, if you like, there's the grassroots and then the grass tops. There's Liz Weaver, a colleague from Tamarack, talks about that we've got to be engaging at those multiple leverage points in the system. But I think in all of this, I want to stress is, so I see all of this as interlinked and needed. And maybe a useful framing is to think about it as a toolkit that we can keep building and expanding and going in with context, guiding it, and the people at the heart of it, rather than a method or an approach. And I know that that's where I've got stuck when I've gone in with that approach, going, okay, I'm going to apply a systems thinking approach, and the conditions just haven't been in place, or there isn't readiness at that time. So yeah, I always kind of get a wee bit of caution around going in too firmly in that way.
Brilliant. Yeah, thank you for that. I think that was very, very rich. I think, and my next question was going to be, you know, sharing some examples that come to mind of where, you know, you've witnessed or you've been part of using some of these ideas behind systemic social change and social innovation to actually create these positive systemic outcomes. And I know, Liz, you've already talked about example, but feel free to add another one if you would like to that. Just to kind of really bring it to alive for our audience. I'm curious, Sharon, if you would like to start with this question.
Yeah, we've been quite fortunate with regards to the projects that we've been working on. We've got we're working with a large one in Western Australia, a food insecurity project, which is being driven by Edith Cowan University, which has been amazing because they've brought researchers onto the project. So they've been in each phase of the project, they've been putting out publications, journal articles, peer-reviewed journal articles, which has just been wonderful to have all of this documentation of this particular project. And this is the Southwest Food Community Project. And that's brought together 52 different food initiatives in Western Australia, in a place, in a region in Western Australia. And they have been using our software to map the characteristics for transitions within those 52 initiatives. And they've also been using our systemic innovation lab methodology. Which is FEMLAS, which is like forming a core team, exploring, mapping using the software, learning from that and then addressing what they find. So then looking at the gaps with regards to how they can actually tweak different initiatives by including different characteristics or creating new initiatives that actually assist the system of initiatives to actually transition to a new state. And because we've had this documentation, it's been really interesting. I think one of the outcomes which we're finding across a lot of our projects that we're working on, because we work mainly with government, is the individual initiatives recognising themselves as part of a system with regards to how they go on to work, which I think has just been amazing. And also the development of new initiatives with this real focus of their contribution to systems change as a collective of initiatives. We've had some of our work, our software was written up as an innovation highlight by the OECD, and we've had a systemic innovation lab process written up in another OECD article last year. And what we found is by having this kind of recognition and by having a tool which does do some form of measurement, we've been able to get into government, which I'm just finding fascinating in Australia, because a few years ago I thought there's no way in the world I'm going to be able to walk through the door of government and get them to use complexity science for place-based initiatives. And now we're working with local government, state government and federal government on projects, which has just been amazing. And I think part of that is being able to have some rigor in what we do, being able to actually show systems change to government. And so I see the next stage for us is really the focus on measurement to assist government to take the risk to take this kind of approach.
Brilliant, thank you. And I know you mentioned a few kind of case studies, a few examples. I think if you could share those links and we can add them in the YouTube comments, I think that would be hugely valuable for the community. Yeah, and Per, just moving on to you, curious if you have any examples that come to mind.
Yeah, we as I'm mostly involved in research, the focus is on developing analytical frameworks and so on. We have studied many cases, and I can share those, and we have collected some of them. Some of them are historical cases that goes back 200, 300 years, and looking at using social innovation as the framework to understand how ideas have a large-scale impact. Now I have some books like these that Francis Wesley have been editing. So I'll share all those. But I think in this context, I just want to do it. It's more of a shout out, because I don't do the case justice. It's the case of R Labs, R as in R Labs in South Africa, Cape Town, and it's an organization that started out in the Cape Flats, which is it's also these areas around Cape Town where a lot of people were moved during apartheid. So it's the townships, right? And they struggle with a lot of issues around gang-related. The gangs are very strong in these areas, so there's a lot of drugs. There's a lot of prostitution, a lot of violence associated with that. But it's almost like a governance system that actually provides for people. So, but it's something that is, you can see as a system that has its self-reinforcing feedbacks. So in that space, they go in and they try to move people out of that, provide a platform where these people come in and be part of building something new. So you recognize probably that from a lot of like these kind of projects. around the world. But it's just fascinating. As I said, I won't go into detail, but you can look up yourself. The way they're working is a very sort of system-aware, complexity-aware methods that they have basically developed themselves, and which includes like working with women and in bringing women into programs of education around just becoming computer savvy with the intention that they call geeky moms. The course is called Geeky Moms. I'm not sure it's running still, but it's about actually strengthening the voice, especially in social media, of these women, and in that way also addressing what we talked about before, this aspect of transformative change, power, right? Changing power relations. And then they also work with, if they're going to have a project on unemployment, they say, who's the expert on unemployment? Well, this is this guy who's been unemployed for 15 years. So they're changing the concepts of who is the expert. And that's also one of the key aspects of changing roles and routines, who's doing what and how. So, and then they also work a lot with inner, like they sometimes refer to as inscaping, is connecting your inner capacities and what do you call it, abilities to the systems change that you want to achieve through your organization. So it's aligning those. It's a ways of aligning yourself and your inner world with the outer world. So it's fascinating to see that, and it's interesting to see how they start to achieve more and more. And the impact is, I think, is very interesting in that they have developed a sort of alternative and then maybe an improvement of the education system in South Africa, and that they start to challenge the existing education system. But also it has spread. This idea of R Labs has spread to 21 countries, including the North. So the global North. So that's interesting from a sort of challenging the usual knowledge transfer in a way that's happening. So it's really challenging, this sort of, here's the innovation, social innovations coming from the global South and really spreading. So I just want to recommend people to go in and see that, and maybe in the people who's listening, maybe someone is from our labs.
Helps. Yeah. Thank you very much for that. And Liz, I'm curious if you have anything to add to that, but also I'd be very curious to ask you, Liz, about, I know that a lot of your work centers around kind of empowering local communities to enact systems change. It's not necessarily a third party coming into this complex, challenging situation and saying we're going to take leadership on everything. I really liked how you put it, that sometimes it's creating a shared understanding and giving responsibility to people on the ground and nurturing that leadership. But I'm quite curious. Of course, there are large institutions that are kind of potentially trying to address these difficult social problems, such as governments, foundations, and large charities. And I'm curious to hear from your perspective, do you feel that there's something that local communities have in terms of like a power or like an untapped kind of potential that maybe these other stakeholder groups, it's difficult for them to get on that level? I mean, how would you describe your relationship with these local communities and how they can come to create social impact?
Yeah, lovely question, Baron. I guess, I mean, I think what you're saying there is very core to what we're seeing. So, I mean, in terms of case studies, instead of going into them on our platform C, there's 5 video case studies, which are all different examples of community-led systems change in Australia, where that power dynamic has been shifted. And I think what's emerging, and Sharon, you just spoke to it, I think over the last, say, 10 years, there has definitely been a shift in, there's a bit of a hunger that people are saying, the ways of tackling complex problems aren't working, we've got to do something. And increasingly what we're seeing is government, philanthropy, business coming to that conversation differently. You know, it's very slow, it's nudging. And as I said before, often the people or the departments who are taking up that role aren't incentivized, or in fact, you know, often they're put in a separate unit like the innovation unit, and they sit quite separately from the rest of the company. So if it works, that's great and it's rewarded. But often a lot of that work is about, you know, making sure, instead of engaging with the usual suspects, how do we go to the people most impacted? And so I think to just acknowledge there is a growing nudging and awareness in more formal institutions about the need to come at this different. And there's some bright spots we're seeing, and, you know, some of the case studies we've got are there. But to come to your question about kind of what is it around that, I think, and maybe being in COVID, we're starting to see the need for and the rise in people, you know, the need to connect and be engaged locally in community and solve our own problems. And, you know, I come from a paradigm around adaptive leadership that the system has got the wisdom to solve its own problems. So people like me or whoever else coming in, you know, all we can do is nudge and guide and frame and reframe and bring different tools. But at the end of the day, it's the people who are grappling with that challenge who have to be the ones to address it. So I guess we see our role as being, we walk alongside those initiatives to play a multitude of roles. And in many ways, you could say we're an intermediary between the kind of the broader system and the power brokers, the stakeholders, government, philanthropy, funders, whoever. And what we're trying to do is convene people so that everybody is coming to that issue in a different way. But doing that in a way where we are placing a value on, say, the people most impacted by the complex issue, those who've got lived experience, the citizens who are living in the place. Because, you know, often they know, if I use an example of a community in Northwest New South Wales in Australia, an Indigenous community, Burke, that we've been walking alongside for a number of years, they basically, you know, were leading the kind of charts on youth incarceration, young people being locked up, entrenched, disadvantaged challenges. It made headline news, and government did what they do. You know, they're going, we've got to fix this problem. And the leaders and the elders in that community said, we want to address it. We want to work differently. And we've kind of been walking alongside them over the last 6-7 years and bringing in a justice reinvestment approach to look at and being able to kind of work with different people to say, can we come at this differently, where we're using innovation and we're looking at the system. And 6-7 years in, that community is getting amazing results in a decrease in incarceration rates for young Indigenous people, some policy changes at senior levels, because we've had the kind of the policy people involved, the funding, with the aim that the funding that is going into keeping young people locked up gets reinvested into the community to come up with community solutions. So drops in family violence, uptake of young people staying at school, more young people getting driving licenses, which was one of the reasons why they were being locked up, because they didn't have licenses, so they were stealing cars. So, you know, we see the knock-on effects. But I think, and again, that's on Platform C. It's a lovely example of starting with where the community is at, not where we're at, and going, how do we work with how they're framing the issues, the solutions, and then being able to mobilize and enable the system around that to be following that lead. But, you know, that does require everybody to come to the issue, being willing to learn and being willing to learn into where do we innovate, as opposed to as coming in as experts. And I think that's one of the biggest paradigms that's really hard to shift as we grapple with all these ways that to keep learning into it, really valuing that expertise. And I think just to pick up on something Sharon said, which is particularly relevant in Australia, is there's a real need to build the evidence case nationally, internationally for systems innovation, systems change, and that the more that we can share the stories of both what's working, but also what we're learning, and share that as a field, we can start to see the patterns and the dynamics. And increasingly, that's what people are looking for, and funders, so that they can take the risks that, you know, this requires for them to come to the table differently.
Definitely.
Thank you, Liz. And yeah, thank you. I mean, for me, it's just flown by, but we're about reaching the 1 hour mark now. So I think we've had lots of questions from the audience. So I think it'd be great to just kind of invite those as well. And so the first question, and it's something that we've kind of approached in different directions, is, so the question is, in order to do social innovation, as we've said, human interest and buy-in is needed from people that may not be initially aware or even interested at it to begin with. And how do we kind of catch and maintain their attention and support to kind of create this momentum? And yeah, just whoever feels they would like to answer this, and it could be more than one guest, feel free to step up.
I'm happy to have a shot.
Yeah, go for it.
I guess with regards to the work the work that Wicked Lab does, it was really hard to try to sell what we did in the beginning, because we don't do anything new. So we go into a community and we're working with the existing and what people are already doing with regards to their initiatives. So all we're coming in with is, I guess, a platform for people to actually bring together and create coherence of existing initiatives that are existing in a community. And it's a case of people are already doing their thing. And I guess what they're getting out of this experience of coming together as a solution ecosystem with a piece of software that allows them to see their part they're playing within a system, it's nothing new for people, in a way of, we're not asking them to do anything new, but once they actually see their role within a system and see themselves as a system player, then they can see how they can tweak things they do so that they can actually help the system perspective to move forward. So it's quite easy for people to engage because we're coming in where they're at.
Thank you.
And just to build on that, I think I'd say that the starting point has often been, where's the point of pain that people are facing, that, you know, the way they've been tackling things hasn't worked. And certainly in the early days, what we did a lot of was looked at examples in other countries and other places where a different way of working was bringing about some of the results that they were looking for. So for example, we've engaged a lot with what's been happening in Canada about looking at addressing poverty, and, you know, investing in bringing people from other countries to learn from the process of that and the conditions in place. So really, I think there's again, and I guess it's one of the things you asked was about a call for action, is to look at how we come together as an international community to learn from what's happening in other places, but also we can be great allies in building that movement to build a case for change. And whilst context is really different, I think what we saw and what we were enabling was conversations where people can learn about, how did you in that role, whether it's in government or business and philanthropy, create the conditions to take that first step and to test, we're going to give this a go. And we've got some boundary around it, but we've got enough authorization to do it. And I think often what we're talking about is enabling people to take up their authority, to test something and give it a go to build that momentum. But certainly what we see works is people going, it's worked elsewhere, and so let's give it a crack, but needing that body of evidence to talk to that, which is hard in long-term systems change, which we know takes time. So I think there's a real partnering collaboration opportunity.
I think I just want to add to that in short, because it's that aspect of how do you keep momentum and how do you keep engagement, because that's something very important for change makers. And one of the questions we ask is how do you take care of yourself, because changing systems and often requires a pushback. So with the notion that if you're doing something transformative, there's probably going to be a pushback, and if you don't get that pushback, you might not do something transformative. So it's good to think about that. But that also means if you're doing something transformative, there are many social innovators out there that basically put their lives to risk in trying to change systems. So it's a really important issue, is how to keep the momentum, how do you take care of yourself, and how do you build support in staying with it,
Yeah, thank you. And I think one thing that quite resonated me with just then, Per, and it was mentioned previously, is that when you're doing something transformative, it could almost be that a feedback loop, as counterintuitive as it sounds, of that you really are doing something transformative, is when you're getting a lot of feedback from the system to say, oh, we don't, this is different. So that's an interesting perspective. I think this question could be quite relevant to people who are quite new to this field, but are really interested in the ideas and want to really start kind of enacting it and putting it into practice in kind of a fast kind of way. And so this question is kind of around, what would you say are kind of the minimum variety of concepts, or kind of some of the core ideas that could be used as leverage points for social innovation? And also the second part is, how could you report, measure, and reflect on the level of social innovation in kind of like a minimum amount of effort kind of way?
I'll have a crack, because that's a kind of how long's a piece of string question. I think there's something really about, in terms of measuring, I'll start with that, which is about really building up, if you like, a developmental practice to be able to be in reflective loops all the time, because this work of systems change innovation is just a constant learning process. So I think both concepts or approaches which support the ability to learn as a system, but also to learn as yourself. So we're constantly working with that system self horizons, that the work as a systems change entrepreneur or whatever means being able to see yourself as a system all the time. And so there's many things. I mean, for me, it would be adaptive leadership, which is how you help systems adapt to face new realities. And that includes you, that includes me. So it's, we're in a constant reflective loop with our small teams, with our collaborations, then the broader systems, and building that mechanism in to also then measure, what does impact and success look like? So, what happens, so what? And what are we going to do to iterate, to bring that learning in, probably in its simplest form, helps us build up a bit of a narrative, if you like. And sometimes that's all we can tell is a story around how the system is shifting based on what we're learning and what we did and iterated as we went, until we're able to get very concrete measures of impact. And I think, like I said earlier, for sometimes it's that we've got a group of people at the table working together who would never have come together to figure that out before, and they stayed there even when the heat got high. That's a measure of success on some of these really hard issues, like Per said, where you're getting massive pushback. And I think it speaks to cultivating a practice that we can't do alone. And I think I would also plug for really working on power literacy. I think this is a kind of emerging edge, and the work of Julie Diamond around power intelligence has been really formative in our work around developing a literacy at an individual and a system level, the awareness of and use of and impact of power. And that's all within a kind of frame around process work as well. So they're just a few, but I'm sure the list is endless.
Yep, Sharon.
Can I make a comment? Yeah, measurement is I think it's coming into my passion area lately. I've just written a couple of papers for a conference the next couple of months. I ran a focus group in Adelaide end of last year with state and local government workers to find out what it would require for complexity approaches to measurement to be accepted by government. And this was very vector analysis, like the speed and the direction of systems change. And that was quite interesting with regards to, they could see the worthiness of it, but then there was a need for an education process for it to be accepted. And they thought that what was needed was a really holistic approach to measurement, where we still kept the traditional theory of change, program logic for initiatives, did the systems change as well, and then wrapped it up all with a narrative with regards to targets and created a story of change with regards to moving this forward. So I think my passion is for government acceptance of system change measurement, and that's because I focus on wicked problems, and wicked problems are complex social policy problems, so government are in there, and so I have I don't think the hard part is the complexity and the systems change. I think the hard part is the interface of that with government systems, and so getting government to accept measurement, I think it requires an holistic approach that brings in what they're comfortable with new ways, and to create a story.
Yeah,
thank you.
I just want to pick up on that too, and especially Liz, you pointed to that the developmental evaluation, I think, aspects, right? And Mike Quinn Patton and Mark Shabai that you mentioned has been involved in and developing, and it's using evaluation to help you navigate complex situations where you don't know exactly where you're going and how to get there, etc. But it's using evaluation then as a way of getting real-time data on what are you doing and the direction. So I think there's a lot of measurements in that, basically a tool that is also related to what you said, Sharon, these kind of complexity measures. And what I like about it is just that it changes things like evaluation as something that triggers a fear of failure, at least in my organization, to an excitement for learning. So it's a very, I think it's a really nice tool that way, and that has been picked up especially a lot in philanthropy organizations. And so I recommend that developmental evaluation by Mike Quinn Patton.
Brilliant, thank you. I think this next question, and maybe we have time for one or maybe two more questions. This one seems quite relevant today because there are so many kind of interconnected issues that we're facing. And the question is, how do we go about prioritizing the various social issues we face and take a systemic approach towards incremental progress?
I think it depends who you ask, doesn't it? I think it's so, I think it's a good question, but it's a hard one. There's not one concrete answer. I think a lot of the focus is there's the complex issues that we are personally being drawn to address. So, you know, in Collaboration for Impact, our whole vision is on creating an inclusive, equitable world. So that gives us lots of different entry points. However, what tends to happen is it's the complex problems that we are being hit with. So COVID, you know, is one that whilst there's been talk about pandemics for a while, it's just not been on anyone's horizon. So I wonder if it's more about being clear on how do we build that capacity to manage whatever complex problem we're in, that we're faced with, because depending on where we sit and what country and what sector we're in, it's going to look different. But to see that that is actually our work, like the world's more complex, we need to be able to see the interconnectedness and look at how we work on them. And, you know, in the Australian context, I would say addressing First Nations disadvantage is highly linked in with climate emergency, increasing inequity, you know, globalization. They're all interlinked, but maybe it comes back to, and I think it's a leadership question, which is, you know, given who we are and what resources we have and the focus we bring, where can we have most impact, given who we are and the networks that we have, and that helps determine where do we then intervene, and what is our purpose. But I just think this is the next kind of skill edge that people are going to need to navigate whatever complex challenges we face. Sorry, that's incredibly broad, but I could give you my top 5.
I would just say, Bowen, that with the work we've done, I've been quite fascinated with, because the thing is, people come to us with their problem and their place, and so we go to where the demand is. But I have noticed that the areas that are more keen to take a complexity approach are the food systems, the greening of cities, the kinds of challenges where they've naturally got an ecosystem flavour to them. And I think the participants in those kind of system approaches find it very easy to relate to taking a systems approach. And it's just something I've noticed, that, you know, the food system people are there, and the greening people are there, and the waste people are there. So the people who are naturally thinking in systems are more attracted to this way of working.
And I just want to say that it's such an interesting area. And just something very general is that one of the challenges we have, if we talk about living in the Anthropocene or being a driving force on this planet, and have pushed a lot of our ecosystems that we depend on to the absolute brink, it becomes the big challenge, I think, is to as we solve social problems, that has to also mean strengthening our support systems in the talking about ecosystems. So it's sort of that integrated approach and sort of regenerative solutions that I think is so important. And as we see also that some of our research at the center, Stockholm Resilience Center, where I'm based, is that we're looking at these hidden connections between, you know, global fisheries and pandemics like Ebola, or the supply of quality blood in Ghana. How is that linked to land use changes? You know, and you can see that, okay, I want to solve this problem, but actually I need to start here, and maybe in the ecosystem, like starting to work with the natural resource issues to solve this sort of social problem over here, or the vice versa. So I think that's the big challenge, is not just talking about priorities, but also these sort of starting to understand these interlinkages and that are very, very global today.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much. I mean, yeah, unfortunately we're out of time, but and we weren't able to cover everyone's questions from the audience. Apologies for that. But yeah, it's been really insightful. I know that there were a few questions in the comments about kind of software as well, and what particular tools, you know, that we talked about could be useful for systems innovation. So yeah, we can maybe collate those at the end and share them in the YouTube comments. And as well, with the additional resources that we mentioned, we can add those as well, just so we've got like a point for anybody who wants to read further. Another thing I just do want to mention as well for everybody is that we do have a Slack channel for systems innovation, if you're not on there already. And so you can find a link for that on our website. And we even have a topic on social innovation, a discussion topic. So, you know, it could be if you want to bring any ideas, any questions that came up onto there, I'm sure it could be good. Was there anything that any of you wanted to just say in closing?
I would just like to say that the amazing opportunity we're in right now, where we're working, we've got such a disrupted economic system, and disruption usually takes a lot of effort to be able to transition a system. So as someone who has got a bit of interest in social entrepreneurship and seeing a more fair economy, this is the time to actually move. So that would be my call to action.
Yeah. I would just want to say that also take a good look at the capacities for that right now, because we talk a lot about leverage points and tipping points. It's all about getting that system start to roll, but do we have the capacities actually to navigate that ball in any kind of direction towards this just and sustainable world? So a lot of focus on the transformative capacities for exactly this phase is really important right now.
Yeah. And just building on that, I guess it's how do we hold people at this juncture so that when, you know, we're emerging from it, we don't spring back to status quo, but we're able to engage the systems we're in that dialogue about what do we need to keep and conserve, what do we need to let go of that has actually been really useful through this pandemic, but where do we need to innovate? And I think, even engaging in those adaptive questions is an intervention in the system, and we don't know where that will lead, but it's a great opportunity to leverage, and we need to contain people so that they can do that work. And good luck.
Yeah, good luck to everyone here. Yeah, thank you so much. I think that's a great place to close, and big thanks for everyone who joined today. And yes, thank you. Thanks everyone.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Bye.
Thanks, Per. Thanks, Sharon.
Thank you.